Time to get to military strategy with our special guest, Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Let's welcome him to Therapy Cable Live. Welcome. How are you, Sir Lawrence?
Hello, how are you?
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for being here. This is a fascinating book. It did take me a little while to read, but it was a fascinating
It's a long book, yeah.
I have to ask you, how long did it take you to write that book?
Well, the contract was signed in 1994, but it was basically, I'd say, since 2009. I've been writing it seriously.
Oh, wow. It's a long time.
So it was a while.
I'm going to try to see how we can ask this question, because it is it's quite a large book, wonderful book. I'd recommend it for everybody. Strategy by Lawrence Freedman. One of the first questions is, what really stuck out for you? Because I know when I was reading it, there seemed to be some resonating themes in regards to military strategy. Did you find any of those that really stuck out?
Well, I think the key thing about strategy is every time people start to think about it, say with military strategy in the start of the 19th century or with business strategy in the 1960s, it's the belief that if they understand it properly, they can control situations. They can get far more out of a situation than would otherwise be possible by being cleverer, by being more incisive, by using their resources more effectively than everybody else. So the initial idea behind strategy is it's a means of getting control. And then over time, it turns out to be more difficult than that, and you don't get quite as much control as you would have hoped.
Yeah, that could be a problem, couldn't it? Now, it seems like over the years it evolved. It seems like strategy evolved over the centuries. Things change, obviously, with technology and advancements. Different types of centuries, people were using different tactics. Which one of the periods were the most interesting for you?
Well, I mean, I'm most interested in strategy from when it starts to be used as a word. So it's the Napoleonic period, where the basic ideas that still resonate enormously, especially amongst our military, were developed. But obviously people were doing strategy before they called it strategy. It used to be called the art of war. And it's very different in earlier periods, partly for the reasons that you mentioned of differences in technology. What makes the difference just before the Napoleonic period, I think, is the mass armies, the French Revolution, nationalism as a motivating force in war, but also maps. It's possible to plan a campaign in a way it hadn't been possible to plan it before, and it's necessary to plan it because you've got such large armies to move. So that's why I think this is it turns out to be such an important period in developing our ideas. And the two sort of great thinkers of the 19th century, the Swiss Jomini and the Prussian Clausewitz, who most people have heard of, Clausewitz anyway, yes, were both directly involved in the Napoleonic Wars. They watched it at first hand. So that influenced their thinking and really shaped the generations to follow.
Now, Clausewitz obviously much more recent than Sun Tzu, but do they have a lot of similarities or overlaps at all?
So Clausewitz and Jomini were both believed in the idea of the decisive battle. I think if there's one idea that comes through this period, it's the idea that wars can be won on the basis of
we're going to come back and learn more about the strategy from Lawrence Freedman.
If you defeat the enemy, eliminate them from from being able to support their state, then you've won. You don't have to do much else. The politics is sorted out for itself. And that has been a very powerful idea, that battle is the way to get political results. It's the arbiter of differences. And again, the problems that were faced with strategy, by and large, revolved around the fact that you could win a battle and didn't win the war. There was popular resistance. There were still armies in reserve. And allies came in to help an apparently defeated side. And so actually it turned out, especially when we got to the 20th century, the wars lasted far longer than those who started them hoped.
Absolutely. I think the Iraq War is a classic example, and the Afghanistan War is another one. And I want to bring you a little bit more into modern times. But before I do that, you brought up an interesting point about nationalism. So I have a question for you. It seems in the days now, I'm talking maybe about 100 years ago, we've had these more terrorist activities with the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. We've had the PKK, and all these other groups. It's terrorist groups that are using different types of military strategy. What do you think about those strategies that they're using, these suicide bombers or these terror attacks in different locations? It doesn't seem to be as linear anymore.
I think the problem with terrorism is it's a pretty poor strategy. It's the sort of thing you do when you've got no other means of recourse. It's desperate. And obviously with terrorism you can cause a lot of pain and mayhem, but it's not that easy unless you've got widespread popular support to be able to get people to get to the position where you actually achieve your political objectives. One of the features of a lot of terrorist groups that we can see is that they have incredibly ambitious objectives. Say, ISIL at the moment wanting to establish a caliphate, not just in a bit of the Middle East, but everywhere. The whole Muslim world, the IRA wanted to unify Ireland. Other Marxist groups wanted the popular revolution. There's not very many of them, and they've got puny needs. So they try to sort of shock the state into concessions or encourage the masses to see that the state is vulnerable. It doesn't, by and large, work very well unless you can do it time and time again. But it's done because there isn't much else to do. They don't feel that they don't have sufficient normal popular support to win elections, for example. So the difficult with terrorism tends to be undertaken by very desperate people with very ambitious objectives. And therefore they don't tend to give up. It tends to be a fanatical method as well.
Actually, you remind me of something, and see what your opinion on this is, because you were saying that you needed populist support. And it kind of reminded me of Cuba and Fidel Castro's revolution there. He seemed to get enough support upswell from the crowd, especially against Bautista and the poverty versus the rich versus the poor kind of argument there. Would that be an example of somebody like that, like this kind of desperate group getting the populace?
I think one needs to distinguish between terrorism as we sort of know it in terms of atrocities, especially against civilians, and an insurgency where there is genuine popular distaste for the government, a genuine popular movement, and they don't just have to use extreme methods. They can use strikes, they can have demonstrations, they can start, as was the case with Castro at the end, and Mao in 1949 in China, to put together an army, have an army that overthrows the army of the state. That's different from terrorism. It is worth noting, however, that one of the problems with Castro was that he created a myth about how he came to power, that it was done with a few dedicated fighters that almost by themselves overthrew this corrupt regime of Batista, whereas actually Castro was just one of many that were fighting Batista. Others doing more effective work, possibly in an urban environment, were oppressed or killed. And Castro won in a sense because he was the last man standing. He was the one that when the others had fallen was able to push forward. But they tended to be written out of the script. Also, of course, Castro fought as sort of a more liberal, not as a Marxist. He only decided he was a Marxist after the revolution. So again, there's sort of a retrospect about what happened in the 50s that turned into a myth of what you could do with some dedicated fighters determined to overthrow a government.
That's fascinating, because it does have serious psychological implications, doesn't it? Creating this mythical figure in a sense. Do you think Hitler did the same thing?
Well, Hitler had probably a genuine popular movement, and he didn't make his ambitions, he didn't hide his ambitions. I think the difference, but Hitler also came to power initially through an election. I think the strategy, but you can argue that autocracies develop even when they take over from democracies, by being ruthless about how they use state power. That's how Hitler consolidated his position. He got into power and then he used all the instruments of the state and more to consolidate it. That's a different approach.
We're here at Sir Lawrence Freedman, the author of the book Strategy. Fascinating book, a great read, and very appropriate, unfortunately, for the times we're in. So, Lawrence, I have to ask you, there's so many wars that have happened over the centuries, classic wars, like the Battle of Thermopylae. Do you have any favorites in regards to strategy? Something that stood out for you and you said, wow, I would have never thought about that.
Gosh, I think wars are things you necessarily have favorites about. I suppose what I've studied a lot it tends to be more contemporary conflict. The first war I studied in depth was the Falklands campaign, which is not one that would stand out mainly to an American, but to a Brit it's quite odd because it came by surprise. No plans had been made for the contingency. Everything had to be improvised. And actually, I think it demonstrated the need to work out almost from first principles how you manage a conflict like that, a crisis that developed into a conflict, and was sort of a relearning experience. It was an interesting one to study because the generation of officers who fought it, the senior officers had all fought in the Second World War, and they sort of passed down their knowledge to the next generation through the course of that war. So for somebody who'd actually spent most of my previous career looking at nuclear issues, nuclear strategy as a real war, this one has always intrigued me because of this sort of improvised and surprising quality.
Actually, we do have a question from our viewers, and it's an interesting question. He says, do you think nuclear weapons has changed military strategy at all these days?
Oh, of course, yeah, absolutely. One reason we haven't had a major war since 1945 is because the major powers are scared of war, and for good reason. We don't know what would happen, whether anybody would ever actually use nuclear weapons, but the thought that they might reminds everybody about the dangers of war. So I don't think nuclear strategy works very well in terms of clever ways to use nuclear weapons. That's been looked at and no good way has been found really, but the possibility that it might be used, a small possibility, makes people very cautious, and that's been a very healthy thing. So one reason why, even when, say, take a crisis like Ukraine at the moment, we're cautious about how we deal with Putin, but Putin is also cautious. Why? He's gone for non-NATO members, but he hasn't gone for NATO members. He's talked a lot about Russia's own nuclear capability over the last couple of years to remind us of the dangers of intervening, say more on Ukraine's behalf. So I think nuclear weapons are a very profound and influential feature of the world in which we live.
Absolutely. Is it fair to say the Putin right now going into Ukraine, Putin jumping into the war of Syria, sometimes people see it more like checkers, but in reality it's like chess. One move by Putin is really a prelude to 3 or 4 moves later. Is that fair to say?
No, I'm not sure it is, actually. I'm not sure he's thought it through as carefully as people think. I think he's got himself bogged down in Ukraine. It hasn't gone as he thought it would go. And in Syria, where he made his most recent moves, again, I think he thought it would be more straightforward than it turned out to be. I think he's quite impulsive, Putin.
Oh, really?
Very bound up with the idea of demonstrating Russia as a great power, that it deserves to be noted, that its interests must be given priority, and that animates him clearly. But I don't think he's actually a great strategist. I think people give him sometimes a bit too much credit.
Well, he won't be happy to hear about that. But anyway, and I won't talk about Kim Jong-un because I'm not sure I see much of a strategy there either. But we do have a question. Go ahead.
I don't know. I think Kim Jong-un is scary. If disaster is going to come in Asia, he's the most likely cause because all he has is nuclear weapons. He doesn't have anything else. There are no there are no strategic assets in North Korea other than, well, I suppose the other one is their weakness. Everybody's scared of the consequences of North Korea collapsing. So now that South Korea or China or Japan, for that matter, want it to collapse, so they want it to keep going. On the other hand, Kim Jong-un keeps on threatening people, and he's isolated himself from the Chinese too as well, I think, now. So I think his strategy is basically to hang in, to hold on to power, no more than that, by making him as tricky as possible to deal with. But he could miscalculate, and I think he's come close to that before.
Let's hope he does not miscalculate. That would not be a fun consequence at all. We do have the last question from Jack, a former West Point graduate. He wants to know, is there anything you've written or researched in your book in regards to military strategy that could help at all in fighting ISIL?
Well, I think the issues with ISIL are no different from any counter-insurgency strategy. That is, you've got to isolate the militants and remove their popular support. The difficulty we've got is that in Syria in particular, but also to a degree in Iraq, they're just one actor in an incredibly complex situation where everybody seems to be fighting each other, hedging against each other. So there's no straight fight. If there was a straight fight with ISIL, they could be dealt with, because actually a group like that, like the Taliban in Afghanistan, finds it hard to hold on to territory. They can be very effective as guerrillas, but if somebody's challenging them to hold on to territory, they find it difficult. The problem is that everybody's distracted by something else and is not giving it, not focusing completely on ISIL. And I don't think that'll change, because actually for most Syrians, Assad has been the major cause of carnage. So I think there are. I mean, the problem is not working out strategically. The problem is politics. The problem is getting all the different political actors in line, and I don't think that will happen until we've had much more progress on the Syrian peace talks, which is difficult. What we can do is contain them. I think we can contain them, and I think we can undermine them. And of course, in our own societies, obviously speaking very much as a European here, we've got to watch out very carefully. You know, we've got to work very hard on our counter-terrorism. So it's not easy, but again, I think it's important with these groups not to overstate their quality, but just to recognise how difficult they can be.
Absolutely. We got about 1 minute left. Thank you again for joining us, Sir Lawrence Freedman. The question I want to know now, do you think the Iran deal is making things a little bit crazier down there in the Middle East? Is it causing more problems than good?
I don't think it's as important as either the proponents or the opponents say. It's going to take a while. Iran's economy is in a mess. They'll get some relief from sanctions, but the oil price is hurting them badly, like it's hurting the Saudis and the Russians and others too. It's good that their nuclear program is capped and weakened. I think people underestimate the importance of that, but it's not going to stop Iran. It's not going to change Iranian foreign policy. They're still an assertive, indeed aggressive factor in the region. So I think, I was always wary about saying that this is going to make everything better, because it clearly wasn't going to do that, but nor does it make things as bad as some of the opponents say. It's just, there's so many, again, it's a similar problem with ISIL. There's just so much else going on in that region that nobody ever really gets a free hand.
I think one gentleman definitely has a strategy. It's very simple to handle ISIL. And I wanted to see, this is your last question, what's your opinion? Donald Trump seems to have figured it out. What do you think about that?
If you want to follow war crimes as a strategy, then possibly. I don't think he has a strategy. It actually deals with the real problem. And I suspect in many ways he would make it worse, but I don't want to interfere in American political affairs.
And I'll keep your privacy, and I won't ask you if you signed that petition to ban him either, so we won't bother with that. Once again, Sir Lawrence Freedman, the author of a fabulous book, Strategy. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Sir Lawrence, for being on the show. We truly appreciate it.